I'm your mother. Black waitress confronts billionaire son. His reaction will blow your mind. What if the woman serving your coffee held the key to your entire identity? Amelia's weathered hands trembled as she set down the steaming cup, her eyes fixed on the young man in the expensive suit. 32 years she'd waited tables at Murphy's Diner, watching countless faces come and go, but this face made her heart skip like it hadn't in decades. The birthmark on his left temple, barely visible now but still there, sent memories flooding back to that cold February night in 1992 when she'd made the hardest decision of her life. "More coffee, sir?" she asked, her voice catching slightly. He looked up from his phone, those familiar green eyes meeting hers for just a moment before returning to his screen. He had no idea that the woman refilling his cup was the same woman who'd sung him lullabies until she couldn't anymore. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Amelia Williams had seen her share of wealthy customers at Murphy's Diner over the years, but none quite like Daniel Richardson. Every Tuesday and Thursday for the past month, he'd arrive at exactly 2:30 p.m., order black coffee and apple pie, then spend hours on his laptop, making what sounded like million-dollar deals over the phone. The other waitresses whispered about his designer watches and how he always left $50 tips for a $12 meal, but Amelia stayed quiet, her secret burning like acid in her chest. She'd recognized him the moment he first walked through that door. Not from the business magazines that occasionally featured his face, Daniel Richardson, tech mogul and heir to Richardson Industries, but from the way he still tapped his fingers when he was thinking, the same rhythm he'd drummed against her chest as a baby. The scar on his chin from when he'd fallen learning to walk was still there, faint but visible when the afternoon light hit it just right. "You're staring again, Maggie," whispered Rosa, her longtime friend and fellow waitress, as she passed by with a tray of sandwiches. "That boy's got you all twisted up." Amelia forced a smile and wiped down tables that didn't need wiping. How could she explain that watching Daniel conduct his business calls felt like watching her own flesh and blood become the man she'd always hoped he'd be? She'd given him up when he was 18 months old, not because she didn't love him, but because she loved him too much to let him grow up poor like she had. The adoption agency had promised he'd go to a good family, people who could give him opportunities she never could. And they had. The Richardsons had raised him well. Private schools, college, everything she'd dreamed of for her son. But watching him now, she noticed things that worried her. The way he rubbed his temples when he thought no one was looking. He never seemed to finish his pie, just pushed it around his plate absently. The phone calls made his jaw clench with frustration. "The board doesn't understand the vision, Mike," she'd overheard him say last week. "They see the bottom line, not the bigger picture. Sometimes I wonder if my father built this company, or if it built him." That afternoon, as she refilled his coffee cup, her hand accidentally brushed his. He looked up, startled, and for a heartbeat, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, a recognition that went deeper than customer and waitress. But then his phone rang, the moment passed, and he was back to being just another wealthy customer in her section. What Amelia didn't know was that Daniel had been having dreams lately. Strange, vivid dreams about a woman singing to him in a voice that sounded exactly like the waitress who always seemed to be watching him. In these dreams, he was small again, safe in arms that smelled like vanilla and hope. He'd been waking up with tears on his cheeks, feeling a longing for something he couldn't name. As he packed up his laptop that Thursday evening, Daniel found himself hesitating by the door, glancing back at Amelia as she wiped down his table. Something about her felt familiar, like coming home to a place he'd never been. The call came on a Tuesday morning that changed everything. Amelia was getting ready for her shift when her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, knocked frantically on her apartment door. "Amelia, you need to see the news," she said, her face pale with concern. "That young man you've been watching, something terrible has happened." The news anchor's voice filled Amelia's small living room. Tech mogul Daniel Richardson was hospitalized early this morning following what sources are calling a stress-induced collapse. The 33-year-old CEO has been under intense pressure as Richardson Industries faces potential bankruptcy due to a failed merger. Amelia's legs gave out, and she sank onto her couch, watching footage of Daniel being wheeled into St. Mary's Hospital on a stretcher. He looked so small, so vulnerable. exactly like he had as a baby when he'd run that high fever and she'd walked the floor with him all night, singing softly until it broke. At the diner that afternoon, Amelia could barely focus on her table. Every few minutes, she'd glance at his usual spot. Empty now, the red booth looking somehow lonely without his familiar presence. Rosa noticed her distraction and pulled her aside during the dinner rush. "Honey, you've been acting strange ever since that Richardson boy started coming in here." "What aren't you telling me?" Amelia's composure finally cracked. Through tears she'd been holding back for weeks, she whispered the truth she'd carried alone for 32 years. "Rosa, he's my son. The baby I gave up for adoption, it's him." Rosa's eyes widened, then filled with understanding. "Oh, sweetheart. All this time, you've been serving your own child, and he doesn't know." "I gave him away so he could have a better life," Amelia said, her voice breaking. "Look at what he became, successful, educated, everything I wanted for him. But now he's in the hospital, and I can't even visit because I'm nobody to him. Just the woman who pours his coffee." That evening, Amelia found herself standing outside St. Mary's Hospital, still wearing her waitress uniform. She'd told herself she was just coming to get information, maybe ask at the front desk how he was doing. But as she stood there in the parking lot, memories flooded back, rocking him to sleep, teaching him to say, "Mama," the way he'd reach for her face with his tiny hands. Inside the hospital, Daniel was awake but sedated, staring at the ceiling. The doctors said it was exhaustion, but he knew it was more than that. It was the emptiness he'd felt his whole life, the sense that something crucial was missing. His adoptive parents had been kind and loving, but there had always been a hollow space where his earliest memories should have been. "Mr. Richardson?" A nurse peered in. "You have a visitor." Daniel's heart jumped, thinking it might be Amelia, though he couldn't explain why. But it was just his business partner, Mike, carrying flowers and looking uncomfortable in the sterile hospital room. As they talked about the company's crisis, Daniel's thoughts kept drifting to the diner, to green eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. He'd never believed in destiny, but something was pulling him back to Murphy's diner, to answers he didn't even know he was seeking. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Tomorrow, everything would change, but neither Daniel nor Amelia knew that fate was about to force their paths to cross in a way that would shatter the carefully built walls around both their hearts. Daniel discharged himself from the hospital against the doctor's orders 3 days later. The company crisis demanded his attention, but more than that, he felt suffocated by the sterile walls and the constant stream of business associates who visited out of obligation rather than care. What he craved was the simple comfort of Murphy's diner, the familiar sounds, the smell of coffee, and yes, the quiet presence of the waitress who somehow made him feel less alone. Amelia had called in sick those 3 days, unable to face his empty booth while knowing he was fighting for his life just 5 miles away. But when she saw him walk through the diner's doors that Thursday afternoon, looking pale but determined, her heart nearly stopped. He was thinner, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame, but he was alive. "The usual, Mr. Richardson?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He looked up at her, really looked, and she saw something different in his eyes, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "Actually," he said quietly, "could you sit with me for a moment? I know this sounds strange, but you seem familiar, and I could use some company that isn't trying to discuss quarterly reports." Amelia's hands shook as she poured his coffee. This was the moment she'd dreamed of and dreaded in equal measure. She slid into the booth across from him, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "I've been having dreams," Daniel said, staring into his coffee cup. "About being a child, being held by someone who sang to me. The voice in these dreams, it sounds exactly like yours. I know that's impossible, but—" Amelia felt tears threatening and fought them back. "What do you remember about your childhood, Mr. Richardson?" "I was adopted as a baby. Good family, loving parents, but there's this gap, you know? Like the first part of my story is missing." He looked directly at her then, and she saw the lost little boy she'd given up all those years ago. "Sometimes I wonder if my birth mother ever thinks about me." If she's proud of what I became or disappointed in who I am. The words cut deep because Amelia had wrestled with those same questions every single day. She was proud, so proud it hurt, but she was also heartbroken watching him struggle alone with the weight of a company and a legacy that seemed to be crushing him. I'm sure she thinks about you every day, Amelia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. And I'm sure she's incredibly proud of the man you've become. Daniel studied her face, something dawning in his expression. There's something about the way you said that. He reached across the table, his fingers barely brushing hers. What's your name? Your real name, not just what's on your name tag. Amelia felt the walls she'd built around her secret beginning to crumble. Amelia. Amelia Williams. Williams, he repeated softly, as if the name meant something to him. The diner around them seemed to fade away as 32 years of separation hung in the air between them. Amelia knew she was standing at the edge of a cliff. One more word, one more look, and there would be no going back. Have you ever faced a moment where everything you'd built your life around was about to change? Let us know in the comments. Because what happened next would challenge everything both Daniel and Amelia thought they knew about love, sacrifice, and the bonds that even time cannot break. Next Tuesday, Daniel didn't come to the diner. Or Wednesday. Or Thursday. Amelia tried to convince herself it was normal. Wealthy men like him had busy schedules, emergencies, board meetings. But by Friday, she couldn't bear the uncertainty any longer. She found herself standing outside Richardson Industries, a glass tower that reached toward the clouds, feeling small in her worn coat and comfortable shoes. The security guard looked skeptical when she asked to see Daniel, but something in her eyes must have convinced him to make the call. Daniel was in his office, staring at a genealogy report he'd commissioned after their conversation at the diner. The detective had found records of his birth mother, Amelia Williams, a single mother, waitress, who'd given him up for adoption through Catholic Charities in 1992. The woman downstairs, asking to see him, had the same name. His hands were shaking when he told security to send her up. The elevator ride to the 40th floor felt like an eternity for Amelia. She'd rehearsed what she might say 1,000 times, but now every word had abandoned her. The doors opened to reveal a world of marble and glass, so far from the life she'd known that it took her breath away. Daniel was waiting in his office doorway, the genealogy report clutched in his hand. They looked at each other across the expanse of polished floor, 32 years of separation stretching between them like an ocean. Amelia Williams, he said softly. Born August 15, 1962. Gave birth to a son on February 23, 1992. Placed him for adoption 18 months later. Amelia's composure was finally shattered. I'm your mother, she whispered, the words she'd practiced in mirrors and carried in her heart finally spoken aloud. I'm your mother, and I've missed you every single day of your life. Daniel's face went through a dozen emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, grief, and finally, something that looked like relief. The dreams, he said, his voice breaking. The singing. It was real. It was you. You used to love You Are My Sunshine, Amelia said through her tears. I'd sing it to you every night before bed, and you'd try to sing along with this little voice. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine, Daniel whispered, the melody coming back to him like muscle memory. You make me happy when skies are gray. They moved toward each other then, not as customer and waitress, not as billionaire and working woman, but as mother and son. When Amelia's arms finally encircled him again after all these years, Daniel broke down completely, 32 years of unconscious grief pouring out of him. Why? He asked when he could speak again. Why did you give me away? Amelia held his face in her hands, studying every feature she'd helped create. Because I was 19 years old, working 2 jobs, and could barely feed myself. Because I loved you too much to let you grow up the way I did. Because I wanted you to have everything: education, opportunities, a real future. But I needed you, he said simply. I know, baby. I know. And I needed you too, more than you'll ever understand. As the sun set over the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, Daniel and Amelia began the long process of rebuilding what had been broken, of healing wounds that time had never quite closed. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Because sometimes, the greatest love stories aren't about romance, they're about the unbreakable bonds between a mother and child, tested by time but never truly severed. 6 months later, Amelia hung up her apron at Murphy's Diner for the last time. Not because Daniel had insisted, though he had offered repeatedly to support her, but because she'd chosen to. At 51, she was ready for a different kind of life, one that included Sunday dinners with her son and the family she'd never stopped loving. "You sure about this, Maggie?" Rosa asked, tears in her eyes as she watched her friend pack up her few personal belongings from the staff locker. "That place won't be the same without you." Amelia smiled, the kind of smile that comes from deep contentment rather than mere happiness. "I've spent 32 years serving other people's families their meals. I think it's time I learned to cook for my own." Daniel had handled the revelation of their relationship with the same methodical care he brought to business deals, but with infinitely more heart. He'd arranged family counseling, researched everything about adoption trauma and reunion psychology, and most importantly, he'd simply shown up. Every Tuesday and Thursday, still at 2:30 p.m., but now they talked, really talked, about everything they'd missed. He'd learned that she'd kept every newspaper article about his achievements, that she'd been in the back of the auditorium at his college graduation, that she'd celebrated his successes from afar and worried through his struggles with a mother's heart that had never stopped beating for him. She'd learned that he'd always felt different from his adoptive family despite their love, that success had never filled the empty space inside him, and that he'd been searching for her in every relationship he'd ever had. The Richardson Industries crisis had resolved itself in an unexpected way. Instead of the hostile takeover everyone had predicted, Daniel had restructured the company around a new mission, one that included substantial charitable giving to organizations that supported single mothers and children in need. "I want to make sure no other mother has to make the choice you made because of poverty," he told the board, his voice steady with purpose. Amelia had worried that the other employees would treat her differently once word spread about her connection to their CEO, but Daniel had handled the situation with grace. He'd simply introduced her as his mother, with no fanfare or drama, and somehow that quiet dignity had set the tone for everyone else. Their relationship wasn't perfect. How could it be, with 3 decades of separation to bridge? There were awkward moments, misunderstandings, and the occasional flash of grief for all they'd lost. But there was also laughter, shared memories being created for the first time, and a peace that neither of them had experienced before. Standing in the diner parking lot on her last day, Amelia felt a hand on her shoulder. Daniel had come to walk her out, a tradition he'd insisted on ever since they'd found each other again. "Ready to go home?" he asked, and the word home held weight it never had before. "More than ready," she replied, linking her arm through his. As they walked toward his car, he'd insisted on driving her himself rather than sending a driver. Amelia thought about the words she'd whispered to a sleeping 18-month-old boy all those years ago. "Someday, baby, when you're all grown up, I hope you'll understand that letting you go was the hardest thing I ever did, and loving you was the easiest." If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales that celebrate the enduring power of love and family. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love, loss, and miraculous reunion. Until next time, remember that some bonds are stronger than time itself.